Don't ask us to cancel again. We've waited a year for this show." Those words, sharp and cold, came from my mother through the phone, as if I were disrupting a business meeting instead of lying in a hospital bed awaiting emergency surgery. They echoed in my mind like a slow, deliberate stab, not just painful, but deeply personal. It was Christmas Eve in Denver. Outside, the streets were hushed beneath a soft layer of snow, but inside my hospital room, I was battling a pain that felt like someone was twisting a blade deep in my abdomen. My twins, Caleb and Mia, just over 2 years old, sat quietly in the corner, unaware of how close they were to losing their last parent. And me, I was trying to stay calm, but the terror was mounting, not just from the internal bleeding, but from the harsh truth playing out on the screen of my phone. I'm Lena Brooks, 41 years old, a recent widow still reeling from the car accident that stole my husband less than 6 months ago. That night, I wasn't asking my parents for anything extravagant. I wasn't asking for money or sympathy or even love. I was asking for help. Just a few hours of their time to watch my children while I underwent surgery that, frankly, I wasn't sure I'd survive. But instead of comfort, I received contempt. They were at a hotel on the Strip, dressed up for a Billy Joel concert they had apparently booked tickets for a year in advance. Through the video call, my father's voice cut straight through me. "Lena, there's always something with you. We've done our part. The kids are your responsibility, not ours." It wasn't just the words. It was the ease with which they dismissed me. The same people I'd sent $2,000 every month for the last few years so they could enjoy an early retirement. I thought I was supporting them out of love and duty. I thought family meant showing up for each other, especially in times of crisis. But I realized, in that sterile hospital room, that they didn't see it that way. I had never been more alone. Mara, the nurse checking my vitals, saw my hands trembling as I lowered the phone. She gently touched my arm and said, "I have a friend. She's a trauma-trained nanny. Would you like me to call her?" And in that moment, I understood something I should have known a long time ago. I could no longer depend on people who only saw my children, or me, as a burden. I had spent years trying to preserve this idea of family, trying to give my children grandparents, trying to protect what was broken just so it wouldn't look shattered. But sometimes, clarity doesn't come from loss itself. It comes from the way people walk away when you're already on the ground. Looking back now, I realize the signs had always been there. Subtle at first, like quiet refusals or changed subjects during conversations that mattered most to me, and later more blatant, like skipped celebrations and withheld affection, all signs I'd tried for years to ignore or justify in the name of family. My parents, Marlene and Richard, had always adored my younger brother Travis, their golden boy, their pride, their joy, and I, somehow, had been cast as the responsible one, the caretaker, the one who was expected to give but never ask, to endure but never complain. When I graduated from the University of Wisconsin with honors, after working nights at the diner and surviving on little more than black coffee and scholarship stress, they sent a single text that said, "Nice job," with no punctuation, no call, no visit. Because, as my mother later told me, they were busy flying out to LA for Travis's improv showcase. When I bought my first car, used and barely functional, they dismissed it as a waste of money, yet months later helped Travis lease a brand new SUV because he needed something reliable for his side hustle as a podcast producer. I never questioned their priorities, not aloud, but I felt the bruises of being invisible in a family that only had eyes for him. Years passed like that, and I convinced myself that love could look different for different children. that maybe I was just the sturdy branch of the family tree, while Travis was the blossom they liked to show off. So I made peace with the imbalance, or so I thought, and focused instead on building a life of my own. When I met Jonathan, a gentle, grounded man who understood the ache of being let down by those who should love you most, it felt like I'd finally found my shelter. He didn't come from a perfect family either. In fact, he hadn't spoken to his father in over a decade due to reasons that mirrored my own story more than I dared admit. But with him, I learned what real partnership looked like, what it meant to be seen, heard, and loved without condition. We married quietly in a small chapel just outside Boulder, because I couldn't afford anything grand and didn't want the drama of another family conflict. My parents came, reluctantly, and complained that the seating was too cramped and the food too plain. They left before the first dance and didn't bother to hug Jonathan goodbye. When Caleb and Mia were born, a month early after a difficult pregnancy, I called my parents with tears in my eyes, begging them to come visit. They arrived late, stayed 20 minutes, and left because the babies cried too much, and they had early brunch reservations. That was the first and only time they saw the twins until my emergency surgery. But none of that stopped me from sending them money. Even when Jonathan's accident left us scrambling, even when the insurance claim stalled and the bills kept stacking up, I made sure that $2,000 reached their account every month, like clockwork, because they'd told me they needed it, that they couldn't afford their mortgage after early retirement, that groceries were more expensive now, that they'd downsized their lifestyle, which was a lie I later learned had a beach view condo and a boat nestled inside it. I sent the money anyway, not because I had extra to give, but because I thought maybe this was how I'd finally earn a kind word, a gesture of appreciation, maybe even love. I thought if I kept being the good daughter, the reliable one, they'd notice me, maybe even be proud. But love bought through silence and self-sacrifice is not love at all. It's a debt that keeps growing, even when you've given everything. What's worse is that I let it happen. I tolerated being overlooked, dismissed, and taken for granted, not because I lacked strength, but because I was afraid. Afraid that if I stopped giving, I would lose even the scraps of connection I had. That if I finally said enough, I would become the villain in their carefully crafted narrative, the ungrateful daughter who changed after marriage, who became too emotional after grief, who was never satisfied no matter what they did. But the truth was, they had done nothing, not when Jonathan died in that late-night collision with a drunk driver, and I had to explain to two toddlers why Daddy wasn't coming home. Not when I developed complications from stress-induced ulcers and passed out on my kitchen floor. Not when I told them through sobs that I didn't know how I'd pay the hospital bill. They did nothing. And yet they never failed to remind me of everything they believed they'd done for me, as though my childhood roof and the occasional birthday card were collateral for lifelong obedience. By the time I found myself lying in that hospital bed on Christmas Eve, with my parents' cold refusal echoing through the line, it wasn't just the pain in my abdomen that consumed me. It was the weight of every neglected milestone, every conditional conversation, every invisible wound I'd collected since childhood. It was the quiet realization that I had never been a daughter to them, not in the way daughters should be, treasured, nurtured, protected, but rather a utility, a resource to be tapped until drained dry. And so, as Mara stepped out of the room to call her nanny friend, and Caleb began to hum softly beside my bed, I let the tears come, not just for the pain of the moment, but for every time I'd been made to feel like I wasn't enough, or worse, too much. Because when you finally recognize that someone never loved you the way you needed, or deserved. It breaks something inside you, but it also sets something else free. When Mara returned with news that her friend could be there within the hour, I felt a small ripple of relief beneath the waves of pain and betrayal that still surged through me. Her name was Claire, a former pediatric trauma counselor who now worked privately with families in crisis, and Mara promised she was both capable and kind. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing, but beneath my polite gratitude was a rising fire, faint at first, like a flicker in the ashes, but growing, fed by years of silence and sacrifice I had pretended were love. As I watched my children sitting patiently on the vinyl couch, Caleb humming to himself, and Mia chewing gently on the corner of her blanket, I realized how close I had come to leaving them behind without a plan, without protection, and all because I was afraid to disappoint the very people who had already abandoned me. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking like a daughter and started thinking like a mother. Not just any mother. A mother who had no one else to count on, no spouse to lean on, no family safety net to fall into. A mother whose only choice was to rise. "Could you hand me my phone again?" I asked Mara, my voice steadier now, although my hands still trembled as she placed it into my palm. There were two things I needed to do before they wheeled me away. Two decisions that, for the first time, would not come from guilt or habit, but from self-respect. The first message I sent was to my bank, requesting an immediate halt to all future automatic transfers to my parents' account. I had been giving them that money out of obligation, but now I needed it to protect the only people who had never asked me to be anything but myself, my children. The second message was shorter, but somehow heavier. I will no longer be providing financial support. My children and I deserve better than being your afterthoughts. Do not contact me again. As I hit send, something cracked open inside me, not from pain, but from freedom. Not a cruel freedom, not one laced with anger or revenge, but a quiet, necessary severance. A line drawn, a curtain closed. I had tried to make peace with people who never wanted to understand me, and in doing so, I had endangered my children's stability, my own recovery, and the last fragile threads of my self-worth. When Claire arrived, with a soft smile and calm voice that instantly put Mia at ease, I knew I had made the right choice. She knelt to their level, introduced herself gently, and spoke to them not like someone performing a job, but like someone who genuinely saw them as people, not burdens. Within minutes, the twins had accepted her presence in a way that they had never accepted my parents. Meanwhile, the hospital staff began prepping me for surgery, hooking up IVs and checking monitors, while the anesthesiologist explained the procedure in a voice that was far too casual for the stakes at hand. I nodded along, but my thoughts kept drifting to the transfer I had just cancelled, the message I had sent, and the moment I had chosen my children, and myself, over the comfort of old loyalties. For years, I had clung to the belief that blood meant obligation, that keeping the peace was more important than protecting my peace, that family, no matter how flawed, deserved my loyalty. But lying there, moments away from unconsciousness, I realized I had been loyal to the idea of family, not the reality of it. My parents weren't just failing me in this crisis. They had never shown up when it truly mattered. The surgery lasted 4 hours, though it felt like an eternity blurred by anesthesia and fear. When I awoke, weak and disoriented, Mara was there, smiling softly, and Claire was rocking Mia by the window, while Caleb sat beside her, holding a picture he had drawn of us. Stick figures, smiling, under a bright yellow sun. It was crude and crooked, but it anchored me. I was still here. I had made it through. and I was done apologizing for expecting decency. Over the next 5 days, as I drifted in and out of sleep, I was never alone. Claire stayed in the room during the day, reading to the kids and helping Mara coordinate visits from social workers and child life specialists. While at night, she took the twins back to my apartment and returned in the morning with their favorite snacks and clean clothes. She asked for nothing. No invoices, no promises. Only kindness, quiet and constant, the kind I had begged for my entire life. During a rare lucid moment, I picked up my phone and saw 27 missed calls and a flood of messages, mostly from my parents and my brother Travis. As expected, none of the messages asked about my condition or the kids' well-being. Instead, they spiraled from confusion to indignation, then desperation, demanding to know what had happened to their mortgage payment and accusing me of abandoning them in their time of need. One message from my father stood out like a wound. "You can't just cut us off, Lena. We have a cruise planned next month. The tickets are non-refundable." And that, right there, was the final confirmation. I hadn't overreacted. I hadn't been harsh or ungrateful. I had been right, heartbreakingly, painfully right, to choose myself. 5 days after the surgery, my body was still fragile, and the incision burned with every shallow breath. But my spirit, strangely enough, had never felt stronger. I'd stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, and instead started building a life where I no longer needed permission to protect myself. Claire had been an angel, staying with the twins through every uncertain night, bringing warmth to a hospital room that had once felt like the loneliest place in the world. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was beginning to recover. But as I regained clarity, so did my phone, buzzing constantly with messages that reeked not of concern, but of panic. There were voicemails from my parents and texts from Travis, who apparently had just found out about the surgery. At first, their messages were laced with feigned confusion. "Why aren't you answering? Is this about the concert thing? Are the kids okay?" But soon their tone shifted, first to irritation, then to outright anger. My father, always the master of making himself the victim, had sent me a string of texts, the last of which read, "You can't just walk away from this. We're counting on you. We've made financial commitments based on your support." And then there was the final blow. "We've had to use our cruise savings to make the mortgage. This isn't fair to us." Not once, did they ask how the surgery went, if I was recovering well, or if their grandchildren had been cared for during my hospitalization. All they saw was the severed lifeline of money, the one they had mistaken for unconditional loyalty. Travis's messages were different. He sounded genuinely bewildered, even concerned, asking why Mom and Dad were freaking out, and claiming they had told him I was simply going in for a routine scan. That hit me harder than I expected. I realized, with a nauseating twist in my gut, that they had lied to him, probably to avoid being held accountable for abandoning me during an emergency. I replied simply, explaining the truth, attaching the hospital paperwork and discharge notice to make it undeniably clear. His response came quickly, and it carried a different kind of weight. "I had no idea it was that serious, Lena. If I'd known, I would have helped. I'm so sorry." I believed him. Travis wasn't cruel, just blind, in the same way I had been for far too long. He had grown up soaking in the same poisoned waters, drinking in the belief that our parents' version of love was the only one that mattered. Maybe this was his wake-up call. Maybe mine had come just in time. By the time I returned home with the twins, tired but hopeful, the backlash had spread beyond just the immediate circle. My father, in what I can only assume was a desperate attempt to control the narrative, had emailed our extended family, a long, sanctimonious essay about how I had abandoned them in their time of need, painting themselves as aging parents cast aside by an ungrateful daughter who had turned cold and manipulative. He left out the part where they refused to watch their grandchildren while I faced possible death in surgery. He failed to mention that they'd gone to a concert instead of stepping up when I had no one else. What he hadn't anticipated was how well people knew him. The first public crack came from my cousin Eric, who replied to the thread with a simple but devastating question. "Didn't you just buy a second boat? And isn't Aunt Marlene wearing a brand new Rolex in your last Facebook photo?" Others followed. Some messaged me privately, asking what really happened, while others gently offered support. Homemade meals, temporary childcare help, or just words of encouragement. The truth was breaking through their facade, and for once I didn't have to say much. All I had to do was tell the story straight. The facts spoke for themselves. Aunt Diana, my mother's sister and long-time self-appointed family mediator, called me in tears. She had been under the impression that I was using a minor procedure to manipulate my parents, that I had overreacted. That's what they had told her. But when she heard my voice, still hoarse from anesthesia and stress, she went quiet and said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. They never told us the truth." Meanwhile, Travis was furious. He had believed them, defended them, and now he saw their lies for what they were. He came by one evening, not with accusations, but with casseroles and diapers, and a look in his eyes I hadn't seen since we were kids. The look of someone seeing clearly for the first time. But my parents? They doubled down. The following week, they showed up at my apartment without warning, standing on the other side of the door as if nothing had happened. I looked through the peephole and saw my father standing stiffly, arms crossed in that familiar pose of false authority, while my mother clutched a bag of gifts and wore a tight, rehearsed smile. I opened the door just enough to speak, bracing myself. "What do you want?" I asked, calm but firm. My mother's voice lilted with exaggerated sweetness. "We've been so worried about you, sweetheart. You haven't returned our calls?" "We needed to make sure you and the kids were all right," my father added, though his tone was more demand than concern. "We're fine," I said flatly, "and I don't recall you asking that in any of your messages." He ignored the jab and launched into what he really came for. "We need to talk about this financial situation. The bank called. The mortgage payment didn't go through." There it was. No inquiry about the twins' well-being. No remorse. Just the money. "I told you," I replied, voice steady. "I'm done. No more payments. No more guilt." My mother stepped forward, her smile faltering. "We've built our lives around your help, Lena. We thought we could count on you." "I've been helping out of love," I said. "But love doesn't survive neglect, and it sure as hell doesn't pay off betrayal." They stood there, stunned by the resistance they never imagined I'd show. I was supposed to crumble. I always had. But not this time. Just then, Mia peeked from behind the couch, clutching her stuffed bunny. My mother's eyes lit up. "There's my sweet girl. Grandma brought you—" "She doesn't know you," I interrupted, gently but firmly. "And frankly, I don't think she should. Not until I know you understand what you've done." My father tried once more irritated now than pleading. "You're punishing us for one mistake." "No," I said, finally closing the door halfway. "This isn't punishment. It's consequence." Later that afternoon, as the sound of my parents' knocking finally faded into silence, I sat by the window holding a warm cup of tea and feeling a strange sense of peace. Not because anything had truly been resolved, but because, for the first time, I had enforced a boundary and watched it hold. Still, I knew the storm was far from over. Predictably, they returned the next day, this time bringing reinforcements in the form of my Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister, and long-time family peacekeeper, who had always believed that with enough guilt and nostalgia, anything could be swept under the rug. She called to me through the door with her well-practiced tone of reason and concern. "Lena, sweetheart, don't let pride ruin your family. Your parents are struggling without your help." I didn't open the door. I didn't need to. My voice was steady as I replied, "They managed their finances for decades before I started contributing. They chose early retirement, knowing they couldn't sustain their lifestyle. That wasn't my decision, and it's not my responsibility." She sighed deeply, and then my mother's voice cut in, sharp and rehearsed, weaving the same narrative she always had. "We made those choices because you promised to help us. We never expected you to abandon us in our time of need." I didn't answer that time. I didn't need to justify myself anymore. They were repeating a script that had once controlled me, but I wasn't listening to it anymore. Their version of need had always revolved around their wants: vacations, expensive dinners, designer handbags. And somehow, I had been the one financing it all while sacrificing my own well-being and scraping by to raise 2 children on my own. Later that evening, the fallout spilled into our extended family inbox. My father, refusing to go quietly, sent a group email to over 20 relatives, cousins, second cousins, distant uncles, portraying me as the cruel daughter who had cut them off emotionally and financially with no warning. He spoke of their sacrifices, of the support they had given me through the years, conveniently omitting the part where they refused to help with the twins during a life-threatening surgery because they had tickets to a concert. What he didn't expect was that people had already started asking questions, and that I had already started telling the truth. My cousin Jeremy was the first to reply publicly. He'd always been quiet at family gatherings, the kind of person you'd never expect to take sides, but this time, he didn't hesitate. "Didn't you just post photos from your beach house last month?" he wrote. "And didn't Uncle Richard buy a new motorcycle this year? How exactly are you struggling?" Then others chimed in. Private messages flooded my inbox, some offering apologies for ever doubting me, others sending messages of support. One cousin, whom I hadn't seen since we were kids, offered to drop off groceries and stay with the twins if I ever needed a moment to breathe. A distant aunt from Arizona mailed a handwritten card with a $50 bill tucked inside and a note that said, "You're doing the right thing, and I'm proud of you." Even Aunt Linda, who had stood outside my apartment door just days earlier, called me after seeing the full picture unfold. Her voice was quieter this time, not pushing, just tired. "I didn't know it was that serious, Lena," she admitted. "They told me it was a routine checkup. They didn't mention surgery. Or the kids." I didn't say much. I didn't have to. The truth had started to do what I had never been able to do on my own, dismantle the lie they had built around me. Meanwhile, Travis had become my unexpected ally. Seeing our parents unravel under the weight of their own fabrications had stripped away the illusions he'd held for so long. He started coming by more often, bringing meals, sitting with the twins, helping with laundry. Not because I asked, but because he wanted to. One afternoon, while folding Mia's pajamas, he confessed, "I used to think you distanced yourself because you were cold. But I see it now. They pushed you away long before you ever stopped trying." His words didn't erase the years of resentment, but they did soften something inside me. I had spent so long bracing against judgment, assuming I'd always be painted as difficult or selfish. that I didn't know what it felt like to be understood without conditions. And now, people were seeing me not as the one who left, but as the one who survived. Even Valerie, the nurse who had been with me the night of my surgery, reached out a few weeks later to check in. She invited me to a virtual support group for young widowed parents, something I hadn't even known existed. I attended the first meeting with a nervous heart and an open mind, and within minutes I was surrounded, even through a screen, by people who understood grief the way I did, not as a theory or a tragedy, but as something lived, something carried every single day. Through that group, I met Diana, a real estate agent whose husband had passed from pancreatic cancer 2 years earlier, leaving her with a toddler and a mountain of debt. She listened to my story without judgment, and then offered to help me consider relocating to a neighborhood with better childcare access and lower costs, where I could finally stop just surviving and start building a life again. I realized with every new person who stepped forward that I hadn't lost a family. I had made space for a new one to form, one not bound by blood or guilt, but by kindness, honesty, and mutual care. The life I had feared would crumble without my parents' approval was instead taking root in firmer, richer soil, one act of support at a time. Roughly a month after my surgery, I received a call from Travis that I knew, in some corner of my heart, was coming. His voice was low and uncertain, the way it always was when he didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. "Lena, Mum and Dad just got a foreclosure notice. 60 days to settle or they lose the house." I let the words sit in silence between us, not because I was shocked. I had suspected their finances were on the edge of collapse for a while, but because hearing it aloud made it real in a way I hadn't prepared for. I asked the only question that mattered, my voice even. "What about their savings?" He sighed. "Almost gone. They refinanced last year to buy the boat, and they poured what was left into some shady real estate fund Dad's golf buddy convinced him was a sure thing. It wasn't." His frustration was laced with disbelief, but there was no defense left in his tone, only resignation. That night, I received the kind of messages I used to dread. Long, rambling texts from my parents, now stripped of their usual pretense. No more talk of hurt feelings or miscommunication. These were blunt, pleading cries for help, each one more desperate than the last. My mother's message was the one that struck me hardest. "We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We assumed you were upset and would cool off after a few days. We can't survive without your support." They hadn't just relied on me. They had built their lives around the assumption that I would always be there, like a living insurance policy they could tap at will. Not out of love, not even out of respect, but out of entitlement. And now that I had withdrawn the one thing they truly valued, my compliance, their entire house of cards was collapsing. Meanwhile, my own life, still delicate and far from perfect, had begun to feel stable. The support group I'd joined through Valerie had turned into something more than a bi-weekly Zoom call. It had become a lifeline, connecting me with others who bore invisible scars and shared quiet strength. Diana, the real estate agent I'd met there, had taken me under her wing, helping me explore options I hadn't dared to consider before. Like selling the cramped apartment Jonathan and I had once shared and relocating to a neighborhood with better childcare options, quieter streets, and more space to breathe. She helped me crunch numbers, run market comps, and envision a future where survival wasn't the only goal. We found a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of town with a small yard and a sunlit kitchen, and the mortgage came in lower than what I'd been paying in rent. With the money saved from not supporting my parents, I could afford part-time help from Claire, and still set aside enough to rebuild the emergency fund that had vanished in the wake of Jonathan's death. It wasn't just the space that changed. It was the feeling of having agency, of building something that wasn't beholden to guilt or old family dynamics. When I signed the closing documents, Caleb and Mia sat beside me, colouring in a waiting room, blissfully unaware of what that moment meant, but their presence made it feel like a second chance I hadn't dared to hope for. My parents, on the other hand, weren't rebuilding, they were unravelling. A few weeks later, they showed up again, this time not at my apartment, but at my new doorstep, having somehow discovered the address despite my best efforts to keep it private. My father held a manila folder filled with spreadsheets and statements, his shoulders slumped in a posture I had never seen before. Not defeat exactly, but something close. My mother stood beside him, quieter than usual, but her eyes still darting, still calculating. I let them in, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. I needed to see for myself what desperation looked like when the mask of superiority had been stripped away. We sat at the kitchen table, the twins safely napping in their new room, and my father opened the folder like a man opening a coffin. "We need $144,000 to stop the foreclosure," he said, his voice brittle. "If we lose the house, we lose everything." I looked at the papers, noting the ridiculous expenses, the boat, the timeshare, the boutique hotel stays, and realized they hadn't just lived beyond their means, they had gambled with their future, assuming I would always bail them out. "What about selling the boat?" I asked. "And the timeshare?" "We'd take a loss," my father said immediately, as if the idea of inconvenience was still unacceptable. "Besides, those are part of our retirement plan." I nearly laughed, not out of cruelty, but from the absurdity. "You can't afford luxuries. Retirement doesn't mean entitlement. It means managing your limits." "We could afford them when you were helping," he countered. And just like that, the mask slipped back into place. "It's the least you could do after all we've done for you." "What have you done for me?" I asked, the words coming out softer than I expected, but carrying more weight than any accusation. "Name one moment where you chose me over your comfort. Name one." They didn't. They couldn't. Instead, my mother looked away, her voice cracking as she said, "Without your help, we'll lose everything." "I lost my husband," I replied, my voice steady. "My children lost their father, and we survived. So will you." And I meant it, not out of spite, but from a place of resolve I had earned the hard way. 3 months after that conversation, Travis updated me that they had finally sold the house, the boat, and the timeshare, each at a loss, each a blow to the image they had clung to so tightly. They moved into a modest condo on the edge of town, smaller, humbler, quieter. My father picked up part-time work at a local hardware store, and my mother, once too proud to cook her own meals, started taking senior nutrition classes at the community center. And yet, at every family gathering they still attended, they told a version of the story where I had betrayed them, where I had promised lifelong support, and then, cruelly and without warning, cut them off. They didn't tell people about the surgery, or the silence, or the concert. But they didn't have to. Enough people already knew. And more importantly, I knew. I knew the truth of what happened. I knew that choosing my children and my healing over their comfort was not an act of revenge. It was an act of reclaiming dignity. And as their world contracted under the weight of their own choices, mine began, quietly, cautiously, to expand. A year had passed since the night everything changed. since the moment I realized I could no longer shrink myself to fit into a family mold that had never truly made room for me. It had been 12 months since the surgery that nearly took my life, and with it, the final threads of a loyalty I'd once mistaken for love. And then, on an otherwise ordinary Thursday afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found something completely unexpected. A letter, handwritten and carefully folded inside a plain white envelope. No return address. But I recognized my mother's script the moment I saw it. I held it in my hands for a while before opening it, unsure whether I was ready to revisit the pain, unsure whether I could believe anything written inside. But curiosity, or maybe closure, pushed me forward. Inside, the message was unlike anything I'd received from them before. There was no blame, no bargaining, no guilt-laced pleas for money or reconciliation. Instead, it was something I'd never seen from her in all my life: accountability. She wrote that watching me rebuild my life without them, without leaning on their approval or resources, had forced her to confront things she had long refused to name. She admitted that she had resented my independence, that it reminded her of everything she had been too afraid to become. She acknowledged the ways she and my father had chosen pride over presence, control over care, and how, in doing so, they had lost something they never realized they needed until it was gone: a relationship with their daughter and with their grandchildren. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness, only understanding. She described how they had sold their valuables, downsized their lives, and even begun attending family therapy, something they had once scoffed at, claiming it was for people who couldn't move on. She didn't ask me to respond, only to know that she saw things more clearly now, and that if the time ever came when I was ready, they would show me, not tell me, who they were becoming. I didn't reply immediately. I carried the letter with me for weeks, tucked between the pages of my planner, revisiting it every so often to feel the weight of it again. Not because I was eager to open that door, but because I wanted to know what genuine remorse might sound like. And maybe, just maybe, whether people like them could change when truly humbled by life. During that time, things continued to grow, quietly, steadily, in my own world. Claire remained our steady morning rhythm, helping with the twins while I balanced client deadlines and developed a small but meaningful side business designing memorial websites. A venture born from the tribute I had once built for Jonathan, which had now become a source of comfort for others walking their own grief journeys. Diana and I remained close, and the support group had expanded to include weekend meetups in the park, where our kids played while we talked about parenting, loss, and starting again. Even Travis had evolved. He came over regularly, sometimes just to read to Caleb or help Mia with her puzzles. He no longer asked about our parents unless I brought them up, and when I did, he listened without defensiveness, his loyalty no longer automatic, but earned. He told me that after Dad's minor heart scare last winter, things had shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to make him wonder if their repentance could someday be more than survival-driven. Eventually, I agreed to meet them. Not at my home, not at theirs, but in a quiet cafe near the community library, neutral ground where I could control the beginning and end. They arrived looking older, thinner, subdued. My father didn't bark or scold or deflect. Instead, he looked down as he spoke, his hands trembling slightly around a chipped coffee mug. "I've been a terrible father," he said, voice cracked with something that sounded like truth. "And an even worse grandfather." My mother nodded silently, clutching the letter I now kept safely at home. "We're not here to ask for anything," she added, almost in a whisper. "Only to say we finally understand what we lost, and we don't expect anything back." I didn't forgive them that day, not fully. I didn't pretend that words could repair years of wounds, or that tears could erase the months they spent vilifying me while I was fighting to survive. But I shared photos of Caleb and Mia. I told them about our new home, the twins' favourite books, and the funny things they said during bedtime stories. They listened, not interrupting, not correcting, simply receiving, for once. As we stood to leave, my father asked quietly, "Would it ever be possible, someday, to know them? To see them?" I thought for a long moment, not out of cruelty, but because I had learned that access to my life, and my children's, was no longer guaranteed by blood alone. "That depends," I said gently, "on what you choose to do next, not what you say. They'll only have relationships with people who respect their mother." And with that, I walked away, not bitter, not broken, but whole. I had built something lasting from the ashes of their absence. I had created a life filled with community, with healing, with joy that didn't need anyone's permission. Grief had carved deep places in me, but those same spaces had also made room for grace, and in that grace, I had found peace. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you once called family to protect your peace? If this story moved you, or reminded you of your own, feel free to share in the comments. You never know who might find strength in your voice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of rising again.